Well, this passage comes only in the Gospel of Luke, and it's an interesting passage. And it's a passage that involves two sisters, Mary and Martha. And the interesting thing is that there's one other reference to Mary and Martha in the Gospels, and it comes only in John. And in John, it's the story of the death of Lazarus, the brother of Mary and Martha. Now, this is a very brief commentary story that Luke somehow has picked up from those who have this wonderful memory that is so much a part of oral transition of the messages that were so important in the early days of both Hebrew and Christian literature. As Jesus and his disciples went on their way, he came to a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him in her home. She had a sister named Mary, who sat down at the feet of the Lord and listened to his teaching. Martha was upset over all the work she had to do, so she came and said, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her to come and help me." The Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and troubled over so many things, but just one is needed. Mary had chosen the right thing, and it will not be taken away from her." Now, I don't know if any of you have done any research into the origin of the name that you were given when you were baptized. That first name is the name that you will be called by for a long time in your life, right up until your death, and it will be the name that will be identified in your memory following your death. Let me give you some examples. The name John is an anglicized Hebrew name that means God is gracious. Did you hear that, John? God is gracious. Robert is the anglicized Germanic name meaning bright flame. And I happen to have a middle name of George, and it's an anglicized Greek name meaning farmer. Now, I was a farmer for a while as a kid. It's interesting. Now, Ruth, by the way, and I don't see Ruth and Coach on Zoom today, but Ruth has its origins in Hebrew and means compassionate friend, probably in relationship to the story of Ruth and Naomi. And Phyllis, I have the origin of your name. It originates in Greek mythology. Phyllis was a mythological woman, and it means foliage. Now, let me say more about this. Names also conjure up qualities in terms of what kind of quality does the name conjure up when you hear the name. And the name Phyllis conjures up, and this is due to a study that was done, words like classic, natural, refined, complex, mature, wholesome. That's you, Phyllis. Now, you should know that there was a 1907 painting done of Phyllis and her lover. And it was done by John William Waterhouse. And unfortunately, Phyllis, it won't be allowed to be shown in any of the Florida schools because of its scurrilous nudity. Oh, my. There are two stories in the New Testament, as I indicated, having to do with Mary and Martha. And you may remember the story that's in John. It is Martha who's quite upset with Jesus because she had sent word out to Jesus that his good friend, apparently this was a friendship as well as an acquaintance, but Lazarus was quite ill and was dying. And so Martha sent out this message to Jesus, "Come quickly so that you might pray over him and save him from dying." Well, he died. And Jesus took his good-natured time to get there, which so irritated Martha that she ran out ahead of time and confronted him and said, Jesus, if you had been here, he wouldn't have died. And Martha was really quite disturbed with him. And it's a fascinating story. And we'll get to that at some other time during the course of the year. But in this story, Jesus and his disciples, and we have no idea how many other folks may have been part of the array of individuals who followed Jesus. There might have been some of the women who were part of the company of followers, might have been some curious Pharisees and some teachers of the law, who knows. But anyway, as they're walking through the territory, it's an area. Bethany is the name of the little village, by the way. That's how you got your name, probably. Bethany is the little village, and they come upon the home of Mary and Martha. Now, again, Mary and Martha and Lazarus were living together in this home, and Jesus was a friend of theirs. So he decided they would stop by. So they're gathered apparently outside, and Jesus begins to teach again. He was constantly teaching. And Mary comes out and sits down and is a part of the assembly of people who are listening to Jesus' message. Now, I think I'd do the same thing. I think I would find out what new things he had to say, what expansion on ideas he might have presented. But in any event, I would have been fascinated by listening to him and maybe asking some questions and, raising issues that were of concern to me. So anyway, it's not surprising to me that Mary did that. Now, legend tells us, and then it's indicated in John, that it is Mary who is the woman who came into the house when Jesus, as I said last Sunday, was having dinner with a Pharisee and knelt down and washed his feet with her tears and her hair and poured perfume on his feet. We believe this may be the case. We don't know that to be the case. In any way, here's Mary, who obviously has had this very special relationship with Jesus. She is interested in hearing more about how to save her life and how to live a righteous life as a gift from God. And so she's seated and listening. Martha, on the other hand, is in the house doing what I think would have been quite understandably appropriate. She's getting the place spruced up and cleaned up. She's getting items ready and prepared for a meal, which I've said repeatedly was the very common necessity when someone stopped by your home. You would invite them in and offer them a meal. So Martha is in there and she is overwhelmed. Now, the story is fascinating for a number of reasons, because it's not uncommon to the kinds of experiences we've had either with our own brothers and sisters who, when we were asked to do something together, our brother or sister kind of lagged behind and didn't do much. And so we whined about how come they're not doing as much as we are doing. And if you have children, more than one child, and you've asked them to do a particular chore together, like maybe clean the bathroom or clean the living room or rake the leaves, well, one of them will likely not do it, and the other one will come in and complain and moan. I'm guilty of having done that. My brother, who was a year younger than me, when we lived on the farm, my parents worked in town, both of them. So it was my job and my brother's job to milk the 7 or 8 cows that we had and get the milk into a can and get the can down to the end of the driveway so that the milk truck could pick it up. Well, my brother was always thinking of something else to do. And of course, I was the responsible one. Being the firstborn child, it was a burden, I must say, to say the least. But anyway, I whined a great deal about my brother not carrying his load. So Martha comes out to Jesus and says to him in a kind of arrogant way, why don't you tell Mary to come in and help me? I've got so much to do. I am so overwhelmed. I need some help. And Jesus says, Martha, Martha, what she is doing is the right thing. And at that point, I think if I had been Martha, I would have said, okay, all of you people who are here, you prepare the meal. I'm going to sit down with Mary and listen to you. But she didn't do that. It was a teaching moment for Jesus. The teaching moment was that what was crucial for everyone's life was to listen to the good news from the one who had come to proclaim the good news. And that you could delay and put off all those other things, but it was so important to listen to the good news, to hear what Jesus has to say about life and about God's love and about how we can live our lives in a world that's not always loving and caring and compassionate, and how we need to respond to people who are discounted and rejected and oftentimes put out as being unworthy and not valuable. So Martha is sitting there learning from this and discovering what it means to be a follower of Jesus in an even more intense way. Will she attend to cleaning the house one day? Yes. Will she attend to making a meal for a visitor? Yes, she will. But in that moment, this was just not an ordinary person who had stopped by. This was their friend. But beyond that, this was more than their friend. This was Jesus. Now, Mary and Martha both had heard that Jesus had been proclaimed to be the Messiah. That would have been an important thing in their lives, to know that indeed there were those who believed that Jesus, this their friend, was in fact the promised Messiah. So Mary would have wanted very much to listen to him. If in fact she was the one whose sins had been forgiven, as she's washing his feet with her tears, pouring perfume upon his feet, she would have wanted very much to stay connected with him, because she had given him life and freedom and hope and a future. Indeed. Now let's talk a bit about Martha. It may well be that the writer of the gospel account is a bit misogynist in his behavior and attitude toward Martha. Martha is a doer. She is a compulsive person who likes to be active and involved. And, interestingly enough, let me tell you what those names mean. Mary is the name that is given to one, and it was obviously the mother of Jesus. She had the name Mary. The name Mary comes both from Hebrew and Egyptian lineage, and they mean a drop of the sea. Now that's an interesting way to describe it. The drop of the sea would be a drop of seawater, which would be a drop of water that is heavily infused with salt. And so the other definition or description of Mary is bitter. Now that's interesting, not bitter as in unhappy and resentful, but bitter in terms of reflecting that life has its bitterness. Life has its pain and its suffering and its sorrow. And the other name that is often given to the name Mary is beloved. Beloved. Now, the name Martha has an interesting background. It comes also out of a Greek tradition, and it has to do with terms like mistress and the term master. Now, it's the feminine name in Latin for the name Martha, which is master. Now, it's very clear that Martha exhibits in this story that she was the mistress of the house. But if in fact she was terribly responsible for things that would happen within that house, she was also the master of that household. Now, it's not at all uncommon that we husbands recognize that the message that comes from our wives are really important, and we pay attention to them. We learn that our husbands, as husbands, we are partners with the women who really do have insight into how life might be lived differently. And we, as we share it, need to hear them as they share it as well. They are masters of their gift of birthing. They are masters of their gift of offering children insight and guidance and direction. And they call on us as husbands to be masters of being good husbands, caring husbands, loving husbands, and good examples for the children that we bear together and raise together. That is how Martha is understood in the New Testament and her name. Now, what might we learn from that? Number one, it is indeed so likely that we will attend to the issues that are insignificant in our life. Whether we are persons who have great levels of anxiety, so that we end up focusing on little things that become big things in our mind, and so they immobile us and paralyze us from making decisions, or paralyze us from making wise choices. Or indeed, we oftentimes have these little things that we do that we know are sins, but we overlook them. But they then become bigger and bigger in their size. So Martha obviously had focused on getting that meal ready and attending to this wonderful person who was not only their friend, but was the proclaimed Messiah. She had that as her responsibility. She saw that. She was compulsive about it and was upset that others did not pay attention to her. If we focus our lives on those things, we will oftentimes miss the wonderfully big story about life that comes to us from a loving and caring and compassionate and forgiving God. Secondly, we need to listen. Now, I say this knowing that I sin as much as anyone does. I fail to listen. I don't know if you're a lot like me, but sometimes when I'm focusing on a story on my cell phone, nothing else happens in the world. Isn't that true, Nancy? And indeed, listening sometimes is a fault of mine. We are called to listen and to listen to one another. Listening indeed is our way of affirming the other person's value and worth and their right to share with us their concerns and their interests. What Mary was able to demonstrate was that listening to Jesus was primary at that moment, was the most important thing that she could do in all of her life at that moment, was to listen to Jesus. Now, that was a lesson that Martha needed to hear. Martha, Martha, Jesus says, she did the right thing, and no one can take that away from her. And finally, it's important for us to listen to the message. What is the message? If we're not listening, we won't hear the message. When I'm not listening, I don't hear the message. The message is very clear. I have come to bring love and hope and joy and forgiveness and salvation in such a wonderful way that that salvation occurs now, right this moment. That's what Jesus is saying. And in the long term, it is salvation that God offers to all who offer themselves to him in honesty and in confession and in devotion. To hear that message is crucial and may be the most important message that we'll ever hear in all of our life. And it is a message that we need to ask others to listen as we share it lovingly, kindly, and gently through our actions, through our thoughts, and through our words. That's who we are as a church. That's who we are as disciples of Jesus. We are asked to be Marys, and we are asked to hear, as did Martha, that what Mary was doing was the right thing to do in that moment. God bless you. Amen.